Hey YouTube, it's your girl Dr. J, and I am participating this week in a blog hop for the Gifted Homeschoolers Forum. Now, the Gifted Homeschoolers Forum is an absolutely wonderful resource for anyone who is educating gifted children. There's going to be a link in the description box to the Gifted Homeschoolers Forum website, as well as a link to the place in the site where you can see what other bloggers are doing for this month's topic, which is parenting gifted children. Now, the aspect that I'm going to talk about of parenting gifted children is parenting children that don't exist. And I know you're going, how does that happen? And that is that we are part of a relatively extreme minority group, and that is gifted people represent about 10% of the population. So about 10% of children in the country are gifted. And we are African American. So African Americans represent about 13% of the U.S. population. So now we're getting down to a relatively small group of people. Within the gifted community, my children are also on the far end of the continuum for giftedness. So they have tested in the highly to profoundly gifted range. So I have two children that tested in the highly gifted range and one child who is profoundly gifted. So again, that becomes a much smaller subset. And then we homeschool. So on top of that, you're talking about only 3% of the United States population, families in the United States homeschool. So you're talking about a very small window of people, or a small group of people. And sometimes that group is so small that people assume that group does not exist. And there are some serious consequences to the assumption that these children don't exist. And that's one of the reasons why I talk about this topic so much. One of the things that motivated me to first become a person that speaks out a lot about the fact that there are gifted children in the United States, and there are also gifted homeschoolers. Gifted African American homeschoolers, or brown homeschoolers, not just African American, but Hispanic and Puerto Rican and Cuban and all the other beautiful shades of brown that we have, is because when my oldest was school age, we lived in a state, and I had called the gifted coordinator for the county that we lived in to inquire about how our children placed into the gifted program. And I was told that most children have to test into the program, but African American children do not have to test into the program. They only have to show motivation to learn. And I said, well, why wouldn't black children have to test into the program? And I was told by the coordinator of the gifted education program for the public school system in my county that the reason why they didn't make black children test was because black children couldn't do well on the test to qualify for the program. Now, I'm sitting here with test scores from a child that not only meets but exceeds to a large degree the score needed to be a part of this program. And yet I have this expert on the other end of the phone telling me that it's impossible. Black children cannot test well on an IQ test. They cannot have a score high enough to get into the program. So they don't even ask for test scores from black children. And I thought about what it must like to be a black gifted child in that program, and everybody thinks you really don't belong. You couldn't really get into the program. You couldn't really do good enough, so we'll just let you in. Everybody else here is truly gifted, but since there aren't any real true gifted people, we'll just let you come along for the ride. And that conversation brought me back to an experience that we had with my oldest when he was in daycare. And we had just switched to a new daycare. He was 9 months old. And the daycare divided the young child room. They had non-walkers, and then once you became a walker, you could go in with the older children. And when we went, we said, the non-walker room, he wasn't a walker at the time. We said, the room is nice, but I just don't think it's going to be stimulating enough for him. I really would like for him to be in the room with the walkers. And they said, no. We know that this is going to be the best fit. Once he starts walking, he'll be fine. And so we said, okay, we'll try it your way, your rules, your center, we'll go for it. And then about 3 days after he had started, one of the teachers put me aside, and she said, we're starting to see some aggressive, violent behaviors in your child. And I was stunned. I was like, oh my gosh, what? Well, tell me what you're seeing. Well, he's throwing objects at children, and he's getting really close to the children and the other children. So we're seeing some very violent tendencies take place. And then I inquired further, and come to find out what was happening is he was throwing the ball to children, rolling the ball to children, and trying to get other children to play with him. And normally this would be seen as inquisitive behavior, bright behavior, because most 9-month-olds don't know how to throw and catch a ball. And he could not only throw a ball, but he could also catch a ball. And most 9-month-olds don't necessarily want to play with other children. They're still doing parallel play, and he actually wanted to play with other children. So he's trying to throw a ball and roll a ball at children because he expects other 9-month-olds to be able to throw the ball back or roll the ball back. And so instead of this behavior of throwing and catching, rolling, and being able to catch a rolling ball, instead of that being attributed to, wow, this is very bright behavior, these are gifted behaviors, it was attributed to, these are aggressive, violent behaviors that we're seeing in this child. And so that was our first clue, like, okay, this is not, I'm not liking how things are going. And then we talked to the director of the daycare center, and she agreed to go ahead and put him in the older room. Put him in the older room, no problems. No more aggressive behavior, no more violent behavior. All of a sudden, this child who went from a future convict to, he went from this, potential future convict to all of a sudden, oh, he's great. And he was not a walker when he entered the room, but within 2 weeks of being in the classroom, he was not only a walker, he was a runner. And so when he was in a more appropriate setting, he was able to thrive. But before he got into that setting, all the behavior that he showed that was typical behavior in a 9-month-old gifted child was attributed to something not only negative, but stereotypical of what people perceived as normal for this subset of people, for this race and ethnicity. And that really helped me to see that we have to make sure that people do not only see one aspect, and we have to be able to be there to expose that, your judgment is flawed. These children do exist. And if we didn't speak out, if we didn't say, yeah, my children are gifted, they have been tested as gifted, my children are members of Mensa and all these other different programs for gifted children, if we're not out there and if we're not advocating, our children are going to continue to run into these situations where, number one, they're being seen as not really gifted. Oh, well, everybody else got here on their merit, and you got here based on something else. And I didn't want my children to be in a situation where people thought that they didn't earn their spot into a program or an activity or on a team. And the other thing was the very, how it was extremely potentially dangerous for my children in the long term to be in a situation where every typical behavior that they had was every behavior that was typical of gifted children got turned around and became something that was attributed to something that was negative, and negative to the extreme, where your 9-month-old isn't bright, he's violent. So that's when we really began to dig deep into giftedness and participate in programs for gifted children and speak out on behalf of gifted children in general, and also on behalf of our brown gifted children, because they do exist, and we wanted to make sure that especially people who are in fields of education and childhood development knew that these children existed. Another reason why we speak out so much for gifted children, and especially gifted brown children for us, is because it's not so much of wanting to brag, but more about being a lighthouse where people know that it's safe to get into these waters. Everybody knows that you can have friends and family and all that other stuff that they could be different, a different race, different religion, different socioeconomic status, different, intelligence measures, all that's true. But there's just something about walking into a room and being just like everybody else. There's something very freeing in that. And what we have found is that a lot of times with the homeschooling community and in the larger African American homeschooling community, we tended to see people who were very shy about or hesitant about acknowledging giftedness in their children. And there were a few reasons for that. One of those reasons is just because people had those negative experiences where people said, you say, oh, wow, my child got that, and wow, wasn't that cute? And then they try to be like our experience with the gifted coordinator and saying, your child doesn't have that test score. That test score must be wrong because black children can't do well on that test. And so you then get into very protective mode where you go, I don't want to expose my children to these sort of situations. I don't want to put my children out there and people telling them they don't belong at the table. They were admitted based on affirmative action and not because of their test scores. Or you can't trust their test scores, or that's not really true, or you're not really gifted. They got tired of having those experiences, and so they shied away from even acknowledging gifted, let alone participating in gifted programs. The other reason is because a lot of times, because just statistically, there's going to be less black gifted homeschoolers that people see, just because our numbers are small just in the country at large, let alone the population. You're talking about when you start getting at 360 million people in the United States. So, you only got to have about 39 million, African Americans, period. And if 10% is gifted, you're only going to have about 3.9%. Then you talk about 1% of the population being profoundly gifted. So, and now your numbers are getting so small that, per state, there may be 1,000 people in your state, that fall into that category. So people's experience, the opportunity for somebody who is not this minority cubed to have an experience with a minority cubed is going to be very small. And so for all intents and purposes, your child may be the only gifted black homeschooler that somebody else meets. And there tends to be a very large weight on the shoulders of being the only representative for your whatever. Just like if you are sitting in a classroom, I tell people all the time, imagine walking into a room and you are the only male in the room. And then people start to talk about something and they go, well, let's, this is how we think. Tell us how men think. And then you go, wait a minute, I'm speaking for an entire gender? Like the entire male gender is going to be judged on what I say and what I do and how I act. Or if you walk into the room and you're the only homeschooler and everybody else is utilizing public or private or charter schools and they're talking about education, and then they say, well, tell us what do homeschoolers think? And then you go, wow, their entire perception of homeschooling, possibly for the rest of their life, and especially if you're dealing with people who actually have influence, you're talking to a school board or something like that, and you're the only voice for homeschooling, then all of a sudden there's this pressure on you to be perfect, to do everything right, to say the right words, to give the right information, to make sure you don't do anything that would make there be a negative impression of homeschoolers, and then you have that pressure. Well, that's what my children experience pretty much every time they do something, because there's such a small minority of people, and then we have so many gifted black homeschoolers or brown homeschoolers in general who aren't really comfortable stepping out of there because of those past experiences. So we enter into a situation where my children are the only black children at a Mensa event, or my children are the only black children at various outings. And then there's this pressure of, wow, people's perception of this entire subset of people can be based on how my children act, what my children say, how my children do in this competition, how my children do in that contest, how my children do at this event, how my children do in that class. And to put on top of that, they're also dyslexic and they have sensory processing issues. And so, we're, my husband and I are, twiddling our thumbs and biting our fingernails going, oh my gosh, hopefully they, my children, if my children make a spelling error, they're not going to say, I can't believe, obviously these kids can't do this work. They can't even spell. Because nobody assumes, wow, they're bright, so they had a spelling error. Maybe they're dyslexic. No, it's, I told you these kids weren't smart. They, I don't know where they supposedly got these test scores from, but they can't even spell. So they obviously must not be smart. Okay. Or, wow, this child just, reacted so strongly because of this extremely loud noise. Something's wrong with those kids. Not, wow, they may have sensory issues. It's this pressure to be perfect, because in the minds of so many people, you are that only experience. So you become the representation of, 30,000 people are represented by you. That is a lot of pressure. And the black, brown, gifted homeschoolers who are out there really need for other brown homeschoolers of gifted children to come out and feel, paving the way so that there's some comfort, because the more people interact with our children, the more they can stop even considering these myths and stereotypes. The myth that black children and brown children can't do well on an IQ test. The myth that if, brown children exhibit behaviors that could be classified as gifted or delinquent, we go with delinquent because it's more likely to be delinquent. We have to get out there and be involved more to help to counter those negative stereotypes and to force people to deal with some perceptions that they have that just are not rooted in fact and just are not rooted in data. Because data, the more data that's out there, the more we can make sure that there's balance in our representation. And I need for, we all need for our children to have some experience of just being judged as being the individuals that they are. Because it's a lot of pressure for a 6-year-old to represent an entire subset. But when they're always the only, a lot of times people's impression of that group is going to be what they experience with, my 6-year-olds or my 8-year-old. Or for you, if you are a black homeschooler of gifted children and you're going out there and you're participating in these events, and I've talked to a lot of black homeschoolers and they feel the pressure. They feel that people kind of weighing the perception. And if you are hosting events for gifted children, or if you're utilizing events for gifted children, don't forget to be mindful of making sure that there's comfort for everybody in the room. And I say that for my, black homeschoolers, to make sure that, if another homeschooler comes in and they're not, black or brown, that we make sure, our arms are open and wide, just like for people who are most likely to be in that majority situation. Be cognizant of kind of the weights that these children have and the pressure that's been on these children, because we are examples of parents who have been told that our children don't even exist. And it's sickening, it's sad, it's frustrating. And the fight for acknowledgement of existence, let alone acceptance, it's wearying, it's tiring, it's frustrating. But it's a fight we're not giving up, because we will be a lighthouse, and we will ensure that more children, whether they're brown, black, white, whatever, be comfortable and be out there and be known that yes, you do exist. Yes, you are welcome. Yes, you deserve to be whatever spot you earned it. And nobody should tell you that you got it any other way. So I hope this helps to just bring some light onto our experience as, parenting these children who are minorities cubed. I hope this lends some information and some insight into why you don't see a lot of brown gifted homeschoolers who are participating in various programs. It's not because there aren't black and brown gifted homeschoolers. There are. It's just because sometimes there may be less in your community, just because statistically the numbers are going to be less anyway. I mean, 13% of the population is not a really large percentage of the population. I mean, this is a big country, and even that 13% is not equally distributed across the country. So there's going to be some states where you just don't have a really large percentage of black people in general. And black people tend to, and brown people tend to, the homeschool numbers are growing, but they're still a little bit less than that general 3%. But another thing that informs that decision to not participate has been some bad experience that a lot of brown homeschoolers of gifted children have had, and just trying to fight for the acknowledgement that our children actually are gifted. I mean, I've had experiences even here on YouTube. I know when I first started my channel, I had somebody who said, well, you really need to get your kids tested, because sometimes people think their kids are gifted and they're not. They didn't know that my kids are tested, and that's the reason why we paid to have my children professionally tested, was because we knew that there would be so many people who doubted that it was even possible for these children to not only be gifted, but be highly and profoundly gifted. And so sometimes you have families who are just so tired of the fight for acceptance, so tired of the fight for a place at the table, that they just stop trying. And so when give them an opportunity to know that it's safe, to know that their children are going to be in a safe environment, because it's bad enough when you're told that your child who is exhibiting typical gifted behavior is, a future felon, a thug, and all this other kind of stuff, because they're doing the exact same thing that, gifted kids do. And it's bad enough for you to be told that, well, you need a test score to validate this because y'all don't exist. But for your child to have to go through that, for your child to be told, you're not really smart, you don't really belong here, you're not really gifted, and for you to have to give your child their report from the psychologist to say, yes, this is your score, you earned this score, because they're being told by other children in the room that, black people aren't smart, Hispanic people aren't smart, Puerto Ricans aren't smart, Cubans aren't smart, not like us. Okay. That gets tiring. And I've met very, very few parents of brown gifted children who have not had that experience. It's unfortunately not, I wish it were uncommon. It's not uncommon. And so sometimes that drives that hesitation of even participating because you get weary of parenting these amazing children and having to balance the rejection that they will likely face from, some aspects of society who attributes their existence to being as plausible as unicorns and fairies and other fairy tales. So sometimes it's tiring, sometimes you get weary, but we're staying in there because we've been meeting some amazing other families of brown gifted children who are being homeschooled, and there's more and more people who are starting to be forthcoming, to want to participate, to want to give their child access to all of the wonderful things that are available for gifted children, and to start to change the dialogue, not just with homeschoolers, but in the education community in general, because there's too much damage that's been done for children who were gifted, and that giftedness was not acknowledged because of other people's bigotry and bias. And so we can't back down, and we can't stop because the need is too great. So I hope this helps to kind of bring that conversation to the forefront. I hope this helps give people a little bit more insight into what it's like parenting gifted, homeschooled, profoundly gifted, homeschooled, 2E minority children. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments box below. Or if you just have a comment, feel free to leave it. And I have enjoyed this topic. I'm sorry it went so long. 8 minutes is a long time. I apologize for that. But I wanted to make sure that what I said was complete. This is Dr. J, and I'm out. Bye-bye.